Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the darker corners of history. As you settle in for a restful evening, perhaps curled up in the comfort of your modern home with its clean running water and sanitary facilities, I invite you to transport yourself back to a time when such luxuries were unimaginable. Before we begin this unsettling yet fascinating exploration, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you find yourself drawn to these deep dives into history's more disturbing chapters, please consider subscribing so you never miss an episode. Tonight, we're venturing into the cramped, fetid streets of medieval cities, where death lurked around every corner and disease was an ever-present companion. Picture, if you will, stepping through the gates of a typical medieval city in the year 1300. The assault on your senses would be immediate and overwhelming. The stench would hit you first, a nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting food, animal excrement, and the sickly sweet smell of death that seemed to permeate everything. But let us begin our journey by understanding how these urban nightmares came to be. The growth of medieval cities was a phenomenon that emerged from necessity rather than planning. As Europe slowly recovered from the collapse of the Roman Empire, trade began to flourish once again. Markets sprang up at crossroads, river fords, and the gates of monasteries and castles. Over time, these temporary gathering places evolved into permanent settlements, attracting merchants, craftsmen, and laborers seeking opportunity and protection. However, unlike the carefully planned cities of the Roman Empire with their sophisticated aqueducts and drainage systems, medieval cities grew organically, haphazardly, and without any consideration for public health. The result was a chaotic maze of narrow streets, overhanging buildings, and cramped quarters that would become breeding grounds for disease and misery. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow lanes of medieval London, Paris, or Florence. The streets, if they could even be called that, were rarely more than 6 feet wide. Buildings leaned precariously toward each other, their upper stories jutting out over the path below, creating a perpetual twilight at street level. The lack of sunlight meant that moisture clung to every surface, creating the perfect environment for mold, mildew, and the diseases they harbored. The streets themselves were not paved with stone or even cobbles, but were simply packed earth that turned to mud with the slightest rain. This mud was not merely dirt and water, but a toxic soup of human and animal waste, rotting food scraps, and the detritus of daily life. City dwellers would empty their chamber pots directly into the street, often with little more warning than a shouted "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "garde à l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water." This practice of throwing waste into the streets was not merely a matter of convenience, but necessity. Most medieval cities lacked any form of sewage system. The sophisticated Roman sewers had long since fallen into disrepair, and the knowledge of how to build and maintain such systems had been largely lost. Instead, cities relied on what they euphemistically called gong farmers, men who would collect human waste, usually under cover of darkness, and cart it away to be sold as fertilizer to farmers outside the city walls. The gong farmers, also known as night soilmen, performed one of the most dangerous and revolting jobs in medieval society. They would descend into the primitive cesspits that served as communal toilets, often working by candlelight in spaces filled with toxic gases. Many died from asphyxiation or disease, their bodies discovered only when they failed to emerge from the putrid depths they worked in. The pay was good by medieval standards, but the life expectancy was devastatingly short. Consider the case of Richard the Raker, a gong farmer in 14th century London whose death was recorded in the city's coroner rolls. Richard met his end when he fell through the rotting wooden planks covering a cesspit and drowned in the filth below. His death was noted not because it was unusual, but because it happened during daylight hours when witnesses were present. How many others died in similar circumstances in the darkness of night? their bodies never recovered, or their deaths never recorded. The technology of waste removal was primitive and dangerous. Gong farmers used simple tools, long-handled scoops, buckets, and ropes to extract the accumulated waste from these pits. The work was done at night not just to avoid offending the sensibilities of city dwellers, but because the gases that accumulated in these spaces were often lethal. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other toxic compounds would build up to dangerous levels, creating an atmosphere that could kill a man in minutes. The waste that was collected had to be transported through the city streets in carts, creating another source of contamination and disease. These carts would leak their foul contents as they rumbled over the uneven roads, leaving trails of sewage that would be tracked into homes and businesses. The very act of waste removal thus became another vector for disease transmission. Water, that most basic necessity of life, was another source of constant danger in medieval cities. The same rivers that served as sources of drinking water also served as dumping grounds for waste, both human and industrial. Tanners would dispose of their toxic chemicals and decomposing animal hides upstream from where families drew their daily water supply. Butchers would throw blood and offal into the rivers, creating a crimson flow that mixed with the sewage and industrial waste. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and countless other rivers throughout Europe became open sewers by the medieval period. The very water that sustained life in these cities was simultaneously killing those who depended on it. The wealthy might have access to springs or private wells, but even these sources were often contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits and graveyards. The well water, often touted as safer than river water, was frequently contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits and graveyards. In densely packed cities, it was virtually impossible to dig a well that wasn't within contamination distance of some source of pollution. The wealthy might have access to springs or cisterns, but the poor relied on whatever water they could find, regardless of its color, smell, or the things floating in it. The process of water collection itself was fraught with danger. Public wells and fountains were gathering places where diseases could spread rapidly through communities. The buckets, ropes, and other equipment used to draw water were rarely cleaned and could harbor pathogens that would contaminate even relatively clean water sources. The communal nature of these water sources meant that one infected person could potentially contaminate the water supply for an entire neighborhood. Most people instinctively understood that the water wasn't safe to drink, which led to the widespread consumption of ale and wine, even by children. A typical medieval city dweller might consume several pints of weak ale daily, not for pleasure, but as a safer alternative to water. This low-alcohol beverage was less likely to harbor deadly pathogens, though it was far from sterile. The brewing process itself was often conducted under unsanitary conditions. Brewers would use whatever water was available, and the vessels used for brewing were often contaminated with bacteria and other microorganisms. The fermentation process would kill some pathogens, but many others could survive and even thrive in the alcoholic environment. The result was a beverage that was safer than water, but still posed significant health risks. The quality of ale varied dramatically depending on the skill and honesty of the brewer. Some brewers would water down their product to increase profits, while others would add questionable ingredients to improve flavor or extend shelf life. The lack of regulation meant that consumers had little protection against adulterated or contaminated beverages. The housing conditions in medieval cities were perhaps even more appalling than the streets. Buildings were constructed primarily of wood, wattle, and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. These materials were cheap and readily available, but they were also porous, allowing moisture and vermin to penetrate easily. The timber frames were often green wood that would warp and crack as it dried, creating gaps that let in rain, wind, and pests. The construction techniques used in medieval cities were primitive and often dangerous. Buildings were erected quickly and cheaply, with little regard for structural integrity or longevity. The foundations were often inadequate, causing buildings to settle unevenly and creating cracks that would let in moisture and vermin. The lack of proper drainage around buildings meant that water would pool against foundations, creating ideal conditions for rot and pest infestation. Most urban dwellers lived in single-room accommodations, often sharing space with their animals. Pigs, chickens, and even goats might live on the ground floor of a building, while the human occupants lived above. The animals' waste would seep through the floorboards, creating a constant source of contamination. Families of 6 or more would crowd into spaces no larger than a modern bathroom, with no privacy and minimal ventilation. The practice of keeping animals in the same buildings as humans was driven by both economic necessity and security concerns. Animals represented valuable assets that needed protection from theft, and the shared body heat helped keep buildings warm during cold winters. However, the health consequences of this arrangement were severe. Animals carried diseases that could be transmitted to humans, and their waste created breeding grounds for insects and other disease vectors. The overcrowding in medieval housing was extreme by modern standards. Entire families would sleep in the same bed, often sharing it with boarders or extended family members. The lack of privacy meant that infectious diseases could spread rapidly through households, and the close quarters made it difficult to isolate sick individuals. The stress of living in such cramped conditions also weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to disease. The lack of windows in many buildings was both a blessing and a curse. While it provided some protection from the elements, it also meant that fires and candles were necessary for light even during the day. The combination of open flames, wooden buildings, and cramped conditions made fires a constant threat. When fire broke out, it could spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods, as buildings were built so close together that flames could leap easily from one to another. The few windows that did exist were often covered with oiled cloth or thin sheets of horn rather than glass, which was expensive and difficult to obtain. These coverings provided little protection from the elements and would deteriorate quickly in the damp conditions of medieval cities. The lack of proper windows meant that buildings were poorly ventilated, allowing stale air and toxic gases to accumulate. The heating systems in medieval buildings were primitive and dangerous. Most homes relied on open fires for warmth, with the smoke escaping through holes in the roof or crude chimneys. The lack of proper ventilation meant that buildings were often filled with smoke, which could cause respiratory problems and eye irritation. The constant exposure to smoke also made people more susceptible to lung diseases. The industrial activities within cities added another layer of pollution and disease risk. Blacksmiths filled the air with toxic smoke and metallic particles. The forges burned coal and charcoal, producing clouds of sulfur dioxide and other harmful gases. The metalworking process itself created fine particles of iron, copper, and other metals that could cause lung damage when inhaled. Tanners used urine and feces to process hides, creating a stench so overwhelming that they were often forced to work on the outskirts of cities. The tanning process involved soaking animal hides in solutions of urine, dung, and various chemicals, creating a toxic brew that could contaminate water supplies and soil. The smell was so intense that it could be detected from miles away, and the chemical runoff from tanneries would poison streams and rivers. The leather production process was particularly hazardous to both workers and nearby residents. Tanners would collect urine from public houses and private homes, storing it in large vats where it would ferment and become even more toxic. The process of treating hides with these solutions created clouds of ammonia and other harmful gases that could cause respiratory problems and chemical burns. Butchers slaughtered animals in the streets, leaving blood and entrails to rot in the open air. The lack of proper slaughterhouses meant that animals were often killed wherever it was convenient, with little regard for sanitation or public health. The blood and offal from these operations would attract flies and other pests, creating additional sources of disease transmission. The meat that was produced under these conditions was often contaminated with bacteria and parasites. The lack of refrigeration meant that meat would spoil quickly, especially in warm weather. Butchers would try to disguise the smell and taste of spoiled meat with spices and salt, but these measures were often inadequate to prevent food poisoning. The slaughter of animals in public spaces created additional hazards. The blood and waste from these operations would seep into the ground, contaminating water supplies and creating breeding grounds for disease vectors. The carcasses of animals that died from disease were often processed alongside healthy animals, spreading pathogens throughout the food supply. Brewers dumped their spent grain and other waste wherever convenient, attracting rats and other vermin. The brewing process produced large quantities of organic waste that would ferment and rot if not properly disposed of. This waste would attract insects and rodents, creating additional disease vectors. The spent grain would also ferment in the streets, producing alcohol that could intoxicate animals and create public nuisances. The waste from brewing operations was often dumped directly into water sources, contaminating rivers and streams. The organic matter in brewery waste would consume oxygen in the water, creating dead zones where fish and other aquatic life could not survive. This environmental damage had cascading effects on the food supply and public health. The presence of animals in medieval cities was ubiquitous and problematic. Pigs roamed the streets as living garbage disposals, eating refuse and human waste. While this might seem like a practical solution to waste management, the pigs themselves became sources of disease and contamination. They would root through garbage, spreading filth and parasites throughout the city. Their waste added to the already overwhelming pollution of the streets. The practice of allowing pigs to roam freely through city streets was common throughout medieval Europe. These animals were valued for their ability to consume organic waste, but they also posed significant health risks. Pigs could carry diseases that were transmissible to humans, and their omnivorous diet meant that they could spread pathogens from one location to another. The behavior of these urban pigs was often unpredictable and dangerous. They would compete with humans for food scraps, sometimes becoming aggressive when hungry. The animals would also damage property, rooting through gardens and even entering buildings in search of food. The presence of large numbers of pigs in the streets created traffic hazards and made navigation difficult for residents. Horses and oxen, essential for transportation and heavy labor, produced enormous quantities of manure. A single horse could produce over 30 pounds of manure per day, and cities might have hundreds or even thousands of these animals. The manure would accumulate in stables, streets, and marketplaces, creating mountains of waste that bred flies and other disease-carrying insects. The management of horse manure was a constant challenge in medieval cities. The waste would accumulate quickly in stables and streets, creating ideal breeding conditions for flies and other insects. The smell was overwhelming, and the waste would often be tracked into buildings on people's shoes and clothing. The decomposing manure would also produce toxic gases that could cause respiratory problems. The economic value of horse manure led to the development of a trade in the substance. Farmers would purchase manure from cities to fertilize their fields, but the transportation of this waste created additional health hazards. The carts used to transport manure would leak their contents along the roads, spreading contamination to rural areas. The integration of stables into urban areas created additional health risks. Many buildings had stables on the ground floor with human living quarters above. The ammonia and other gases produced by decomposing manure would rise through the building, creating toxic living conditions. The moisture from animal waste would also promote the growth of mold and mildew, further compromising indoor air quality. The diet of medieval city dwellers was another factor that contributed to their poor health and susceptibility to disease. Most people subsisted on a monotonous diet of bread, ale, and pottage, a thin gruel made from whatever grains, vegetables, or scraps were available. Meat was a luxury that most could afford only occasionally, and fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and expensive. The nutritional deficiencies caused by this limited diet had far-reaching consequences for public health. The lack of vitamin C led to scurvy, a disease that caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and slow wound healing. The absence of adequate protein in the diet resulted in muscle wasting and weakened immune systems. The shortage of fresh vegetables and fruits meant that people were deficient in many essential vitamins and minerals. The bread, which made up the bulk of most people's diet, was often adulterated with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to stretch the expensive grain. Bakers were notorious for their dishonest practices, and the quality of bread varied dramatically depending on what one could afford. The poor ate dark, coarse bread that was often moldy or contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The problem of bread adulteration was widespread and systematic. Bakers would use whatever cheap materials they could find to increase the volume of their products. Sand, chalk, and even ground bones were sometimes added to flour to make it heavier and more profitable. These additives could cause serious health problems, including dental damage and intestinal blockages. The milling process itself was often unsanitary. Grain would be ground in mills that were infested with rodents and insects. The millstones would wear down over time, adding grit and stone particles to the flour. The storage of grain in damp conditions would promote the growth of mold and other fungi, contaminating the flour with toxic substances. The problem of ergot contamination was particularly serious. This fungus would grow on rye and other grains, producing compounds that could cause severe neurological symptoms. Outbreaks of ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire, would periodically sweep through communities, causing mass hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The symptoms were so severe that they were often attributed to supernatural causes. The lack of proper food storage meant that spoilage was common. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products would quickly go bad, especially in warm weather. People learned to mask the taste of rotten food with spices and herbs, but this did little to prevent the food poisoning and intestinal diseases that were constant threats. The preservation techniques used in medieval cities were primitive and often inadequate. Meat would be salted, smoked, or dried to extend its shelf life, but these methods were not always effective. The salt used for preservation was often contaminated with impurities that could cause health problems. The smoking process would expose food to toxic compounds that could accumulate in the body over time. The storage of food in medieval homes was problematic. Most people had no proper storage facilities, and food would be kept in baskets, sacks, or simple wooden containers that offered little protection from rodents and insects. The lack of proper sealing meant that food would quickly become contaminated with droppings, hair, and other contaminants. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that people would often go for months without access to fresh fruits and vegetables. The lack of variety in the diet not only caused nutritional deficiencies but also made people more susceptible to food poisoning when they did consume unfamiliar foods. The sudden availability of fresh produce after months of preserved food could cause digestive problems and other health issues. The prevalence of rats in medieval cities cannot be overstated. These rodents thrived in the filthy conditions, feeding on the abundant food waste and garbage that littered the streets. They nested in the walls of buildings, in grain stores, and in the thatch of roofs. The rats themselves were carriers of numerous diseases, but perhaps more importantly, they hosted the fleas that would eventually bring the Black Death to Europe. The rat population in a typical medieval city was enormous, possibly outnumbering the human inhabitants. These rodents were incredibly adaptable and could survive in even the most challenging conditions. They would feed on anything organic, from food scraps to leather goods to human waste. Their rapid reproduction rate meant that populations could explode quickly when food was available. The damage caused by rats went beyond disease transmission. They would contaminate food supplies with their droppings and urine, making stored grain and other provisions unsafe for consumption. The rats would also damage buildings by gnawing on wooden structures and creating holes in walls and foundations. Their burrowing activities could undermine the stability of buildings and create pathways for water infiltration. The efforts to control rat populations were largely ineffective with medieval technology. Cats were kept as mousers, but they were often outnumbered by their prey and could not make a significant dent in the rat population. Traps and poisons were used, but these were expensive and not widely available. The lack of understanding of rat behavior and biology meant that control efforts were often misdirected and ineffective. The relationship between rats and fleas was not understood in medieval times, but it was crucial to the spread of disease. Fleas would live on rats and other rodents, feeding on their blood and potentially picking up pathogens in the process. When the host animal died, the fleas would seek new hosts, potentially jumping to humans and transmitting diseases like plague in the process. The seasonal patterns of rat activity had important implications for public health. Rat populations would typically peak in the fall when food was most abundant, then decline during the winter months when food became scarce. This pattern meant that the risk of disease transmission was highest during certain times of the year, though medieval people had no way of understanding these connections. Personal hygiene in medieval cities was rudimentary at best. Most people bathed infrequently, if at all, and when they did, it was often in the same contaminated water sources used for drinking and cooking. Soap was a luxury item that few could afford, and the prevailing medical theory actually discouraged bathing, believing that it opened the pores to harmful influences. The medieval understanding of cleanliness was very different from modern concepts. Many people believed that dirt and grime actually protected the body from disease, and that washing could remove these protective layers. The prevailing medical theory held that the body was governed by 4 humours, and that disrupting the balance of these humours through bathing could cause illness. The few public bathhouses that existed in medieval cities were often sources of disease transmission rather than cleanliness. These establishments were typically poorly maintained, with the same water being used by multiple patrons. The warm, moist environment of bathhouses was ideal for the spread of skin diseases and other infections. The reputation of bathhouses as places of immorality also limited their use by respectable citizens. The lack of personal cleanliness meant that body lice, fleas, and other parasites were universal companions. These pests not only caused discomfort but also transmitted diseases such as typhus and plague. The wealthy might have access to better clothing and the ability to change garments more frequently, but even they were not immune to parasitic infestations. The clothing worn by medieval city dwellers was often a source of disease and contamination. Garments were made from materials that were difficult to clean and were often worn for extended periods without washing. The dyes used to color fabrics could contain toxic substances that could cause skin irritation and other health problems. The lack of undergarments meant that outer clothing would quickly become contaminated with body fluids and waste. Clothing was rarely washed and was often worn until it literally fell apart. The poor might own only a single set of clothes, which would be worn continuously for months or even years. The rich, while having more garments, still rarely washed them, preferring to air them out or use perfumes and pomanders to mask unpleasant odors. The process of cloth production was itself a source of contamination. Textile workers would use urine and other organic materials to process fibers, creating toxic working conditions. The fulling process, which involved treading on cloth in solutions of clay and urine, was particularly hazardous. The chemicals used in dyeing could cause skin burns and respiratory problems. The storage of clothing in medieval homes was problematic. Most people had no proper storage facilities, and clothes would be kept in chests or baskets that offered little protection from insects and rodents. The lack of proper ventilation meant that stored clothing would often become moldy and infested with pests. The medical understanding of disease in medieval times was primitive and often counterproductive. The prevailing theory was that disease was caused by bad air or miasma, which led to some attempts at cleaning up cities, but also to misguided treatments that often made conditions worse. Bloodletting, the practice of deliberately bleeding patients to restore the balance of their bodily humors, was a common treatment that weakened patients and made them more susceptible to infection. The medical profession in medieval times was poorly developed and often based on superstition rather than scientific observation. Physicians were few and expensive, and their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated medical thinking and led to treatments that were often counterproductive. The practice of bloodletting was based on the belief that disease was caused by an excess of blood in the body. Physicians would use various methods to remove blood from patients, including leeches, cupping, and direct cutting. This practice weakened patients and made them more susceptible to infection and other complications. The instruments used for bloodletting were often contaminated and could spread disease between patients. The use of herbal remedies was common in medieval medicine, but the knowledge of which plants were beneficial and which were harmful was often inaccurate. Many herbal preparations were contaminated with toxic substances or prepared incorrectly, leading to poisoning and other adverse effects. The lack of standardization meant that the same remedy could have vastly different effects depending on how it was prepared. The surgical techniques available in medieval times were primitive and extremely dangerous. Operations were performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization, leading to high rates of infection and death. The instruments used were often crude and contaminated, and the lack of understanding of anatomy meant that many procedures were performed incorrectly. Physicians were few and expensive, and their treatments were often based on superstition rather than science. Most people relied on folk remedies, herbal preparations, and prayer when they fell ill. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that minor ailments could quickly become life-threatening, and epidemic diseases could spread unchecked through the population. The training of physicians was inadequate and often based on ancient texts rather than direct observation. Medical schools were few and poorly equipped, and students learned by rote memorization rather than hands-on experience. The lack of understanding of anatomy meant that physicians had little knowledge of how the body actually functioned. The cost of medical care meant that it was available only to the wealthy. The poor relied on folk healers, wise women, and religious remedies when they fell ill. These practitioners often had more practical experience than trained physicians, but they lacked access to the limited medical knowledge that was available. The concept of quarantine existed in some form, particularly for leprosy, but it was not well understood or consistently applied. People with obvious symptoms of contagious diseases might be expelled from cities, but this often simply spread the disease to other areas rather than containing it. The isolation of lepers was one of the few systematic attempts at disease control in medieval times. Lepers were required to live in special colonies outside of cities and to announce their presence with bells or other warning devices. However, the understanding of how leprosy was transmitted was limited, and the measures taken were often ineffective. The practice of expelling sick people from cities was based on the belief that disease was caused by moral corruption or divine punishment. People with obvious symptoms of contagious diseases were often driven out of cities, but this practice simply spread the disease to other areas rather than containing it. The lack of proper medical facilities meant that these expelled individuals often died without care. The working conditions in medieval cities were hazardous and contributed significantly to the disease burden. Craftsmen worked in poorly ventilated spaces, often inhaling toxic fumes and particles. Metal workers suffered from lead poisoning, while textile workers developed lung diseases from inhaling fibers and dust. The long hours and physical demands of medieval labor weakened immune systems and made workers more susceptible to disease. The guild system, while providing some protection for skilled workers, also created monopolies that could limit access to safer working conditions. The secrecy surrounding craft techniques meant that knowledge of occupational hazards was not widely shared, and workers often had no choice but to accept dangerous conditions in order to earn a living. The apprenticeship system exposed young people to occupational hazards at an early age. Children as young as 7 or 8 might be apprenticed to craftsmen, exposing them to toxic substances and dangerous working conditions during crucial developmental years. The lack of protection for child workers meant that many suffered permanent health damage or died from occupational diseases. The seasonal nature of much medieval work meant that workers faced different hazards at different times of the year. Construction workers might face exposure to cold and wet conditions during winter months, while agricultural workers dealt with dust and allergens during harvest season. The lack of proper protective equipment meant that workers were vulnerable to these seasonal hazards. The integration of work and living spaces in medieval cities meant that occupational hazards affected entire families. A blacksmith's family would be exposed to smoke and metallic particles from the forge, while a tanner's family would suffer from the toxic chemicals used in leather processing. The lack of separation between work and home life meant that occupational diseases could spread throughout households. Children were particularly vulnerable in this environment. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that up to half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Those who survived childhood faced the constant threat of disease, malnutrition, and accident. Child labor was common, and children worked in the same hazardous conditions as adults, often in jobs that were particularly dangerous for their smaller bodies and developing organs. The high infant mortality rate in medieval cities was due to a combination of factors. Poor nutrition during pregnancy meant that babies were often born underweight and vulnerable to disease. The lack of proper medical care during childbirth resulted in high rates of complications for both mothers and babies. The unsanitary conditions in which babies were raised exposed them to numerous pathogens from birth. The practice of swaddling infants in medieval times, while intended to protect them, often contributed to health problems. Babies would be wrapped tightly in strips of cloth that were rarely changed, creating warm, moist conditions that promoted the growth of bacteria and fungi. The lack of proper hygiene in caring for infants meant that they were constantly exposed to contamination. The diet of children in medieval cities was often inadequate for proper growth and development. Babies who survived infancy were often weaned onto the same poor quality food consumed by adults, leading to nutritional deficiencies that could have lifelong consequences. The lack of access to fresh milk and other nutritious foods meant that children were often malnourished and susceptible to disease. The education of children in medieval cities was minimal, and most children began working at an early age. The lack of understanding of child development meant that children were often expected to perform adult tasks without consideration for their physical and mental limitations. The hazardous working conditions in which children labored contributed to high rates of injury and death. The seasonal nature of disease in medieval cities added another layer of horror to urban life. Summer brought the risk of food poisoning and waterborne diseases as temperatures rose and food spoiled more quickly. The heat also increased the smell and toxicity of the waste that accumulated in the streets. Winter brought different challenges, as people crowded together for warmth, facilitating the spread of respiratory diseases. The summer months were particularly dangerous for food-related illnesses. The lack of refrigeration meant that meat and dairy products would spoil quickly in warm weather, but people often had no choice but to consume these contaminated foods. The increased activity of flies and other insects during summer months also contributed to the spread of foodborne diseases. The heat of summer would intensify the smells and toxicity of the waste that accumulated in city streets. The decomposition of organic matter would accelerate, producing toxic gases that could cause respiratory problems and other health issues. The lack of proper waste management meant that these problems would compound throughout the summer months. The winter months brought different but equally serious health challenges. The cold weather would force people to crowd together for warmth, creating ideal conditions for the spread of respiratory diseases. The lack of proper heating meant that people were often exposed to smoke and other toxic substances from poorly ventilated fires. The seasonal availability of food meant that people's nutritional status would vary dramatically throughout the year. The harvest season would bring temporary abundance, but the winter months would often bring near-starvation conditions. This cycle of feast and famine weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to disease. The social structure of medieval cities created additional health disparities. The wealthy lived in better neighborhoods, had access to cleaner water and better food, and could afford medical care. The poor were crowded into the worst areas of the city, often in the shadows of city walls where sunlight never reached and where the smell and pollution were most concentrated. The concept of residential segregation in medieval cities was not based on race or ethnicity, but on economic class. The wealthy would live in the most desirable areas of the city, typically on higher ground where drainage was better and air quality was superior. The poor were relegated to low-lying areas near rivers and industrial sites where flooding was common and pollution was concentrated. The difference in housing quality between rich and poor was dramatic. Wealthy families might live in stone houses with proper drainage and ventilation, while the poor were crowded into wooden hovels that were poorly constructed and maintained. The wealthy had access to private wells and gardens, while the poor relied on contaminated public water sources. The access to medical care was largely determined by economic status. The wealthy could afford to consult trained physicians and purchase expensive remedies, while the poor relied on folk healers and religious remedies. This disparity in access to medical care meant that the poor were more likely to die from treatable conditions. The diet of the wealthy was dramatically different from that of the poor. Rich families had access to fresh meat, imported spices, and a variety of foods that were unavailable to the poor. The wealthy also had proper storage facilities and could afford to discard food that was spoiled or contaminated, while the poor often had no choice but to consume questionable food. The rise of guilds and trade associations in medieval cities was partly a response to these terrible conditions. Guilds attempted to regulate trade practices and maintain standards, but they also served as mutual aid societies, providing support for members who fell ill or were injured. However, these organizations also created monopolies and restricted competition, which could keep prices high and quality low. The guild system provided some protection for skilled workers, but it also created barriers to entry that could limit economic opportunities. The requirement to complete lengthy apprenticeships and pay substantial fees meant that many people were excluded from the most desirable trades. The guilds also restricted the number of practitioners in each trade, which could limit access to goods and services. The mutual aid functions of guilds were important for their members, but they also created inequalities between guild members and non-members. Guild members had access to support systems that could help them during times of illness or economic hardship, while non-members had no such protection. This system reinforced the social hierarchies that existed in medieval cities. The quality control functions of guilds were intended to maintain standards, but they were often ineffective in preventing adulteration and fraud. The guild system was based on self-regulation, and members had incentives to overlook violations by their colleagues. The lack of independent oversight meant that guild standards were often more theoretical than practical. The legal system in medieval cities was often corrupt and ineffective when it came to public health issues. While there were laws against throwing waste into the streets or contaminating water sources, enforcement was sporadic and often depended on the ability to pay fines or bribes. The wealthy could often buy their way out of sanitation requirements, while the poor bore the brunt of both the health consequences and the legal penalties. The concept of public health law was poorly developed in medieval times. Most laws were focused on individual property rights rather than community health, and there was little understanding of how individual actions could affect the broader community. The legal system was primarily concerned with maintaining order and collecting taxes rather than protecting public health. The enforcement of what few health regulations existed was inconsistent and often corrupt. City officials who were responsible for maintaining sanitation standards were frequently bribed or intimidated into ignoring violations. The wealthy could afford to pay fines for dumping waste illegally, while the poor faced harsh punishments for the same offences. This created a system where the rich could literally buy their way out of health regulations. The court system in medieval cities was often more concerned with generating revenue than dispensing justice. Fines for sanitation violations were seen as a source of income for city governments rather than a deterrent to harmful behaviour. This meant that officials had little incentive to actually prevent violations, as doing so would reduce their revenue streams. The lack of professional law enforcement meant that health regulations were often enforced by unpaid volunteers or part-time officials who had little training or authority. These individuals were often reluctant to confront wealthy or powerful violators, and they lacked the resources to conduct systematic inspections or investigations. The church played a complex role in medieval urban health. On one hand, monasteries and religious institutions often provided care for the sick and poor. They established hospitals, distributed food, and maintained some of the better water sources. On the other hand, religious doctrine sometimes hindered efforts to improve public health, as cleanliness was sometimes viewed as vanity, and disease was often seen as divine punishment for sin. The hospital system that developed in medieval cities was primarily a religious institution rather than a medical one. These hospitals were often attached to monasteries or cathedrals and were staffed by monks or nuns who had little medical training. The primary focus was on providing spiritual care to the dying rather than treating disease or preventing infection. The conditions in medieval hospitals were often as bad as those in the rest of the city. Patients were crowded together in large halls where diseases could spread rapidly. The lack of understanding of infection control meant that hospitals often became sources of disease transmission rather than centers of healing. The mortality rates in these institutions were extremely high. The religious understanding of disease as divine punishment created barriers to public health improvements. Many people believed that attempting to prevent disease was tantamount to questioning God's will, and that suffering was a necessary part of the human condition. This fatalistic attitude discouraged efforts to improve sanitation or living conditions. The practice of charity by religious institutions, while providing some relief to the poor, also created dependency relationships that could discourage self-improvement. The Church's emphasis on accepting one's lot in life rather than working to change it could inhibit efforts to organize for better living conditions or public health measures. The economic impact of disease in medieval cities was enormous. Epidemics could shut down trade, deplete the workforce, and cause economic collapse. The constant threat of disease made long-term planning difficult and encouraged a short-term mentality that often prioritized immediate profit over public health improvements. The economic disruption caused by disease outbreaks was particularly severe in medieval cities because of their dependence on trade and commerce. When disease struck, markets would close, trade routes would be disrupted, and economic activity would grind to a halt. The recovery from these disruptions could take years or even decades. The loss of skilled workers to disease was particularly devastating for medieval cities. Craftsmen and artisans represented significant investments in training and experience, and their deaths could cripple entire industries. The guild system, while providing some protection for members, could not prevent the economic devastation caused by widespread mortality. The cost of caring for the sick and dying placed enormous burdens on medieval city budgets. The limited resources available for public health were often overwhelmed during disease outbreaks, leading to even worse conditions and higher mortality rates. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that most resources were spent on caring for the dying rather than preventing disease. The impact of disease on trade relationships was particularly significant for medieval cities. Trading partners would avoid cities that were known to have disease outbreaks, leading to economic isolation and further deterioration of conditions. The reputation of a city as a disease-ridden place could persist for years after an outbreak had ended. The psychological toll of living in such conditions cannot be underestimated. The constant presence of death, disease, and suffering created a fatalistic worldview that was reflected in the art, literature, and culture of the time. People lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment, from any number of causes, and this shaped their relationships, their priorities, and their understanding of life itself. The prevalence of death in medieval cities created a culture that was obsessed with mortality and the afterlife. The memento mori tradition in art constantly reminded people of their mortality, while the popularity of works like the Danse Macabre reflected the universal nature of death. This preoccupation with death was not morbid fascination but a practical response to the reality of daily life. The stress of living under such conditions had profound effects on mental health. The constant fear of disease and death, combined with the harsh living conditions, created high levels of anxiety and depression. The lack of understanding of mental health meant that these conditions were often attributed to spiritual or moral failings rather than medical problems. The social relationships in medieval cities were shaped by the constant threat of disease and death. People were reluctant to form close attachments because of the high likelihood that friends and family members would die young. This emotional distance was a survival mechanism that helped people cope with the constant loss that characterized urban life. The religious response to the harsh conditions of medieval urban life was often characterized by extremism and fanaticism. The prevalence of death and suffering led some people to embrace ascetic practices or join religious movements that promised salvation through suffering. The constant threat of death made the promise of eternal life particularly appealing. Trade routes, while bringing prosperity to medieval cities, also served as highways for disease. Merchants and travelers carried pathogens from city to city, region to region. The growth of international trade networks in the later medieval period facilitated the spread of diseases on an unprecedented scale, culminating in disasters like the Black Death. The expansion of trade networks in the later medieval period created new opportunities for disease transmission. The Silk Road, which connected Europe to Asia, became a conduit for pathogens as well as goods. The increased frequency of contact between different populations meant that diseases could spread more rapidly and over greater distances than ever before. The merchant communities that developed in medieval cities were particularly vulnerable to disease transmission because of their extensive travel and trade connections. These communities often lived in close quarters and maintained social networks that spanned continents, creating ideal conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. The seasonal nature of medieval trade meant that disease outbreaks often coincided with periods of increased commercial activity. The arrival of merchant caravans or trading fleets would often be followed by outbreaks of disease, as pathogens that had been dormant during travel would find new hosts in the urban population. The lack of quarantine procedures for goods and travelers meant that diseases could spread unchecked through trade networks. The economic importance of trade made city officials reluctant to impose restrictions that might discourage commercial activity, even when the health risks were obvious. The architecture of medieval cities, while sometimes beautiful, was often designed with defense rather than health in mind. City walls, while providing protection from enemies, also trapped polluted air and created stagnant conditions that favored the spread of disease. The narrow streets and overhanging buildings that provided shade and shelter also prevented the circulation of fresh air and sunlight that might have helped reduce the bacterial and viral loads in the environment. The defensive architecture of medieval cities created microclimates that were often detrimental to public health. The high walls and closely packed buildings created areas of perpetual shadow where moisture would accumulate and air would stagnate. These conditions were ideal for the growth of mold, bacteria, and other pathogens. The gates and walls of medieval cities, while providing security, also created bottlenecks that could facilitate disease transmission. Large numbers of people would be forced to pass through narrow openings, creating opportunities for pathogens to spread from person to person. The guards who monitored these gates were often exposed to travelers from distant places who might be carrying exotic diseases. The construction of buildings in medieval cities was often constrained by the need to maximize the use of limited space within city walls. This led to the development of multi-story buildings with overhanging upper floors that blocked sunlight and air circulation. The lack of building codes meant that structures were often unsafe and poorly ventilated. The materials used in medieval construction were often chosen for their availability and cost rather than their health properties. The use of organic materials like wood, straw, and animal dung in building construction created environments that were attractive to pests and prone to decay. The lack of proper foundations and drainage systems meant that buildings were often damp and moldy. The waste management systems that did exist were primitive and often made problems worse. Night soil men, as mentioned earlier, would remove human waste from cesspits, but this was an irregular service that many could not afford. The waste that was collected was often poorly managed, creating new sources of contamination in the areas where it was dumped or used as fertilizer. The primitive waste management systems in medieval cities were designed more for convenience than public health. The collection of waste was often done by private contractors who were motivated by profit rather than health concerns. The lack of regulation meant that waste was often disposed of in ways that created new health hazards. The transportation of waste through city streets created additional opportunities for contamination. The carts and tools used for waste collection were rarely cleaned, and they would spread contamination wherever they went. The workers who handled waste were often among the most disease-prone members of society, and they could serve as vectors for disease transmission. The disposal of waste outside city walls often created new health problems for rural communities. The dumping of urban waste in fields and forests would contaminate water sources and create breeding grounds for disease vectors. The use of human waste as fertilizer, while agriculturally beneficial, could spread parasites and other pathogens to cropland. The lack of understanding of waste decomposition meant that disposal sites were often poorly managed. The accumulation of organic waste would create anaerobic conditions that produced toxic gases and attracted pests. The lack of proper covering or containment meant that waste disposal sites often became sources of air and water pollution. The integration of industrial and residential areas in medieval cities created additional health hazards. Leather workers, metal workers, and other craftsmen worked in the same areas where people lived, creating toxic conditions that affected entire neighborhoods. The lack of zoning meant that the most polluting industries were often located in the heart of residential areas. The practice of combining residential and industrial uses in the same buildings was common in medieval cities. A family might live above a workshop where toxic materials were used, exposing them to occupational hazards even when they were not working. The lack of separation between work and living spaces meant that industrial accidents could affect entire families. The concentration of similar industries in specific areas of medieval cities created environmental disasters. The tanning district of a city would be saturated with toxic chemicals, while the metalworking quarter would be filled with smoke and metallic particles. The residents of these areas had no choice but to live and work in these contaminated environments. The lack of regulation of industrial activities meant that craftsmen could use whatever materials and methods were most profitable, regardless of their health effects. The guild system provided some oversight, but it was often more concerned with maintaining trade secrets and protecting economic interests than with public health. The seasonal nature of many industrial activities meant that pollution levels would vary throughout the year. The increased activity during certain seasons could overwhelm the limited capacity of medieval cities to deal with industrial waste, leading to acute pollution episodes that could cause widespread health problems. The food distribution system in medieval cities was another source of contamination and disease. Markets were often held in the same streets where people lived and worked, where waste was dumped, and where animals roamed freely. Food would be displayed in the open air, exposed to dust, flies, and other contaminants. The lack of refrigeration meant that food spoilage was common, and the poor often had no choice but to consume contaminated or spoiled food. The medieval market system was designed for convenience rather than food safety. Vendors would set up stalls wherever they could find space, often in areas that were heavily contaminated with waste and pollution. The lack of proper infrastructure meant that food was often displayed on the ground or on crude tables that were rarely cleaned. The transportation of food to medieval markets was often done under conditions that promoted contamination. Food would be carried in carts that were also used for waste and other materials, creating opportunities for cross-contamination. The lack of proper packaging meant that food was often exposed to dust, insects, and other contaminants during transport. The storage of food in medieval markets was problematic. Vendors often had no proper storage facilities and would display their goods in the open air for extended periods. The lack of refrigeration meant that perishable foods would spoil quickly, especially in warm weather. The economic pressure to sell spoiled food rather than discard it meant that consumers were often exposed to contaminated products. The regulation of food quality in medieval markets was minimal and often ineffective. While there were laws against selling spoiled or adulterated food, enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt. The lack of scientific understanding of food safety meant that regulations were often based on appearance and smell rather than actual safety. The legal and social treatment of the sick in medieval cities was often harsh and counterproductive. People with diseases were frequently blamed for their condition and might be expelled from the city or confined to pest houses, institutions that were more like prisons than hospitals. The stigma associated with certain diseases meant that people often concealed their symptoms, allowing diseases to spread unchecked. The concept of contagion was poorly understood in medieval times, leading to inappropriate responses to disease outbreaks. People with infectious diseases were often treated as if they were morally corrupt or spiritually polluted rather than medically ill. This stigmatization made it difficult to implement effective public health measures. The practice of expelling sick people from cities was based on the belief that removing the diseased would protect the healthy. However, this practice often simply spread disease to other areas rather than containing it. The expelled individuals would often die without care, but not before potentially infecting others along the way. The pest houses that were established in some medieval cities were often worse than the conditions that sick people faced in their own homes. These institutions were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and staffed by people who had little medical training. The mortality rates in pest houses were extremely high, and they often served as sources of disease transmission rather than centers of healing. The legal system's approach to disease was often punitive rather than preventive. People who became sick were sometimes fined or imprisoned, as if their illness was a crime rather than a medical condition. This approach discouraged people from seeking help when they were sick and made it difficult to track and control disease outbreaks. The education system in medieval cities, such as it was, did little to promote understanding of health and hygiene. Literacy was rare, and even among the educated, knowledge of disease and sanitation was limited. The prevailing medical theories were often wrong and sometimes harmful, leading to practices that made disease outbreaks worse rather than better. The curriculum in medieval schools was focused on religious instruction and classical learning rather than practical knowledge about health and hygiene. Students learned Latin and theology, but received little instruction in basic health practices. The lack of scientific education meant that even educated people often held beliefs about disease that were harmful to public health. The medical training available in medieval universities was based on ancient texts rather than direct observation and experimentation. Students learned the theories of Galen and other ancient physicians but had little opportunity to study actual patients or conduct research. This theoretical approach to medicine meant that physicians were often poorly prepared to deal with real health problems. The guild system for medical practitioners was poorly developed and often exclusionary. The few trained physicians who existed were expensive and available only to the wealthy. The lack of standardized training meant that the quality of medical care varied widely, and there was little oversight of medical practice. The popular education about health and hygiene that did exist was often based on superstition and folklore rather than scientific knowledge. People learned about health from traditional healers, wise women, and religious authorities who often had little understanding of disease processes. The lack of scientific education meant that harmful practices were often passed down from generation to generation. The seasonal migrations of people in and out of medieval cities created additional challenges for disease control. Agricultural workers would flood into cities during winter months, overwhelming the already inadequate housing and sanitation systems. Pilgrims and merchants would arrive for religious festivals and trade fairs, bringing diseases from distant places and taking new pathogens back to their home communities. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that city populations would fluctuate dramatically throughout the year. The arrival of harvest workers, pilgrims, and seasonal traders would strain the limited resources of medieval cities and create opportunities for disease transmission. The lack of proper planning for these population fluctuations meant that cities were often overwhelmed by the seasonal influx of people. The temporary housing that was provided for seasonal workers was often even worse than the regular housing in medieval cities. Workers would be crowded into makeshift shelters that were poorly constructed and lacked basic amenities. The overcrowding and poor conditions in these temporary accommodations created ideal conditions for disease outbreaks. The religious pilgrimages that were common in medieval times created additional public health challenges. Pilgrims would travel long distances, often in poor health, and would congregate in large numbers at religious sites. The combination of travel fatigue, poor nutrition, and overcrowding made pilgrim gatherings particularly susceptible to disease outbreaks. The lack of coordination between different cities and regions meant that there was little sharing of information about disease outbreaks. A city might be unaware that pilgrims or merchants arriving from another region were carrying infectious diseases. The absence of communication networks made it difficult to implement coordinated responses to disease threats. The military conflicts that were common in medieval times created additional public health crises in cities. Sieges could cut off food supplies and clean water, while the presence of large armies nearby could introduce new diseases and put additional strain on city resources. The wounded and sick from battles would often be brought into cities, overwhelming the limited medical facilities. The impact of warfare on medieval cities was devastating for public health. The disruption of trade and agriculture during conflicts would create food shortages and famine conditions. The military forces involved in these conflicts were often poorly supplied and would rely on cities for food and medical care, putting additional strain on already limited resources. The siege warfare that was common in medieval times created particularly harsh conditions for city residents. The cutting off of food supplies and water sources would lead to starvation and dehydration, while the crowding of people within city walls would facilitate disease transmission. The psychological stress of siege conditions would also weaken immune systems and make people more susceptible to disease. The presence of large armies near cities created additional health hazards. Military camps were often breeding grounds for disease due to poor sanitation and overcrowding. The interaction between military forces and civilian populations would create opportunities for disease transmission between different groups. The weapons and tactics used in medieval warfare often created additional health hazards. The use of projectiles like arrows and stones would create wounds that were prone to infection. The lack of proper medical care for wounded soldiers meant that injuries that might be survivable today were often fatal in medieval times. The treatment of mental illness in medieval cities was particularly brutal. People with mental health problems were often chained, imprisoned, or driven out of the cities. The lack of understanding of mental illness meant that people suffering from conditions that might be treatable today were left to live in the streets, adding to the general misery and chaos of urban life. The medieval understanding of mental illness was based on superstition and religious beliefs rather than medical knowledge. Mental health problems were often attributed to demonic possession, moral corruption, or divine punishment. This misunderstanding led to treatments that were often cruel and ineffective. The treatment of mentally ill people in medieval cities was often inhumane. People with mental health problems were sometimes chained to prevent them from harming themselves or others, but this restraint often caused additional physical and psychological trauma. The lack of proper care meant that mentally ill people were often left to deteriorate in terrible conditions. The social stigma associated with mental illness in medieval times meant that families were often reluctant to seek help for mentally ill relatives. The fear of being associated with madness or demonic possession led many families to hide mentally ill members or abandon them entirely. This abandonment contributed to the population of homeless and destitute people in medieval cities. The religious response to mental illness was often more harmful than helpful. While some religious institutions provided care for mentally ill people, others promoted the belief that mental illness was a sign of spiritual corruption. The practice of exorcism and other religious rituals often involved physical abuse and psychological trauma that made mental health problems worse. The impact of climate on disease in medieval cities was significant but poorly understood. The Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century, brought colder temperatures and more frequent famines, which weakened populations and made them more susceptible to disease. The variable weather patterns also affected crop yields and food security, creating cycles of feast and famine that had devastating effects on urban populations. The climatic changes that occurred during the medieval period had profound effects on public health. The cooling temperatures associated with the Little Ice Age led to shorter growing seasons and reduced agricultural productivity. The resulting food shortages weakened populations and made them more susceptible to disease outbreaks. The increased frequency of extreme weather events during the medieval period created additional health challenges. Floods would contaminate water supplies and destroy food stores, while droughts would reduce crop yields and concentrate populations around limited water sources. The unpredictability of weather made it difficult for cities to plan for and respond to these challenges. The relationship between climate and disease was not well understood in medieval times, but the connections were clearly observable. Cold, wet weather was associated with increased respiratory diseases, while hot, dry weather was linked to increased foodborne illnesses. The lack of scientific understanding meant that people could not effectively prepare for or respond to these climatic health challenges. The seasonal variations in disease patterns were influenced by climatic factors. The increased crowding during cold weather would facilitate the spread of respiratory diseases, while the warmer months would create conditions that promoted foodborne illnesses. The lack of understanding of these patterns made it difficult to implement effective preventive measures. The role of women in medieval cities was often tied to health and disease in complex ways. Women were typically responsible for household sanitation and food preparation, but they had limited resources and knowledge to work with. Midwives and female healers provided much of the medical care available to the poor, but they were often persecuted as witches or charlatans. The responsibility for maintaining household health fell primarily on women in medieval cities. They were expected to prepare food, care for the sick, and maintain sanitary conditions, but they often lacked the resources and knowledge necessary to do these tasks effectively. The limited access to clean water, proper cooking facilities, and medical supplies made their job extremely difficult. The role of women as healthcare providers was significant but often unrecognized. Midwives assisted with childbirth and provided gynecological care, while wise women served as healers and herbalists for their communities. These women often had more practical experience with health and disease than trained physicians, but their knowledge was often dismissed as superstition. The persecution of women as witches was often linked to their role as healers and their knowledge of herbs and medical treatments. The practice of traditional medicine by women was sometimes seen as evidence of supernatural powers or demonic influence. This persecution not only harmed individual women, but also reduced the availability of healthcare for the poor. The legal status of women in medieval cities limited their ability to improve health conditions. Women had few legal rights and little political power, which made it difficult for them to advocate for better sanitation or public health measures. The patriarchal structure of medieval society meant that women's concerns about health and safety were often ignored. The entertainment and social gatherings in medieval cities, while providing some relief from the grim conditions, also served as venues for disease transmission. Public houses, markets, and religious festivals brought large numbers of people together in close quarters, creating ideal conditions for the spread of contagious diseases. The taverns and alehouses that served as social centres in medieval cities were often overcrowded and poorly ventilated. The combination of alcohol consumption, close contact, and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for disease transmission. The sharing of drinking vessels and eating utensils also facilitated the spread of infectious diseases. The markets and fairs that were central to medieval urban life brought together people from diverse backgrounds and geographic areas. These gatherings created opportunities for the exchange of goods and ideas, but they also facilitated the spread of diseases. The temporary nature of these events meant that diseases could be introduced to new areas and spread rapidly before they were detected. The religious festivals and celebrations that were common in medieval cities often involved large crowds and communal activities. The sharing of food and drink during these events created opportunities for disease transmission, while the emotional intensity of religious experiences could weaken immune systems and make people more susceptible to illness. The lack of understanding of disease transmission meant that medieval people did not take precautions to prevent the spread of infection during social gatherings. The absence of concepts like social distancing or quarantine meant that diseases could spread unchecked through communities during times of celebration and social interaction. The transportation systems in medieval cities were primitive and contributed to the spread of disease. The same carts that carried goods might also carry waste, and the horses and oxen that pulled them left manure throughout the city. The lack of proper roads meant that travel was slow and difficult, but it also meant that diseases could spread gradually throughout a region rather than being contained to specific areas. The transportation infrastructure in medieval cities was poorly developed and often dangerous. The narrow streets and bridges were not designed for wheeled traffic, and accidents were common. The lack of proper maintenance meant that roads were often impassable during certain seasons, disrupting trade and communication. The animals used for transportation in medieval cities were themselves sources of disease and contamination. Horses and oxen would leave manure throughout the city, while pack animals would carry diseases from one location to another. The poor care of these animals meant that they were often sick and could transmit diseases to humans. The loading and unloading of goods in medieval cities was often done under unsanitary conditions. Goods would be handled by multiple people and stored in contaminated warehouses before being distributed to consumers. The lack of proper packaging meant that goods were often exposed to contamination during transport and storage. The lack of coordination between different transportation systems meant that goods and people could be exposed to contamination at multiple points during their journey. A merchant might travel through several cities, each with different health conditions, before reaching his destination. The absence of health screening for travelers meant that diseases could spread unchecked along trade routes. The international connections of medieval cities, while economically beneficial, also made them vulnerable to exotic diseases. The Crusades, trade with Asia, and contact with other cultures brought new pathogens to European cities. The lack of immunity to these foreign diseases often made their impact even more devastating than endemic diseases. The expansion of trade networks during the medieval period brought European cities into contact with disease environments from around the world. The introduction of new pathogens to populations that had no previous exposure often resulted in devastating epidemics. The lack of understanding of disease transmission meant that these exotic diseases could spread rapidly through urban populations. The military campaigns of the Crusades created additional opportunities for disease transmission. The movement of large armies across continents facilitated the spread of diseases between different regions. The poor sanitation and medical care in military camps made soldiers particularly susceptible to infectious diseases. The diplomatic and commercial relationships that developed between European cities and other cultures created ongoing opportunities for disease transmission. The exchange of ambassadors, merchants, and scholars facilitated the spread of diseases along with the exchange of goods and ideas. The lack of quarantine procedures meant that these exchanges could introduce new pathogens to European cities without warning. The adaptation of diseases to new environments was a constant process that medieval people did not understand. Pathogens that were relatively mild in their original environments could become more virulent when introduced to new populations. The lack of scientific understanding of disease evolution meant that people could not predict or prepare for these changes. The artistic and cultural life of medieval cities was deeply influenced by the constant presence of disease and death. The memento mori tradition in art, the focus on the afterlife in literature, and the development of the danse macabre all reflected the reality of life in these disease-ridden environments. The beauty that was created in medieval cities is all the more remarkable considering the terrible conditions under which it was produced. The artistic response to the harsh realities of medieval urban life was often characterized by a preoccupation with death and mortality. The memento mori tradition served as a constant reminder of the fragility of life, while the danse macabre depicted death as the great equalizer that would eventually claim rich and poor alike. This artistic tradition reflected the daily reality of life in medieval cities where death was always present. The literature of medieval cities often reflected the harsh realities of urban life. The works of authors like Geoffrey Chaucer provided vivid descriptions of the squalor and disease that characterized medieval cities. The popularity of works dealing with plague, death, and moral corruption reflected the experiences of urban residents who lived with these realities every day. The religious art and architecture of medieval cities was often focused on themes of salvation and redemption. The magnificent cathedrals and churches that were built during this period served as refuges from the harsh realities of urban life. The beauty and grandeur of these religious buildings provided a stark contrast to the squalor and disease that characterized the rest of the city. The musical traditions that developed in medieval cities often reflected the harsh realities of urban life. The development of new musical forms and the popularity of songs dealing with death and mortality reflected the experiences of city residents. The communal singing that was common in medieval cities provided a way for people to cope with the stress and trauma of urban life. The emergence of early forms of public health regulation in some medieval cities represented the first attempts to address these problems systematically. Some cities appointed officials to oversee sanitation, established regulations for food quality, and created systems for isolating the sick. However, these efforts were often inadequate and inconsistently applied. The development of public health regulations in medieval cities was a gradual process that evolved in response to repeated disease outbreaks. The appointment of health officials and the establishment of sanitation laws represented important steps towards systematic public health management. However, these early efforts were often undermined by lack of resources, inadequate enforcement, and limited understanding of disease transmission. The regulation of food quality in medieval cities was one of the earliest forms of public health intervention. The establishment of market inspectors and food quality standards represented attempts to protect consumers from adulterated and contaminated products. However, these regulations were often ineffective due to corruption, lack of enforcement, and limited understanding of food safety. The creation of isolation facilities for the sick represented another early form of public health intervention. The establishment of pest houses and quarantine facilities was intended to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. However, these facilities were often poorly managed and may have actually facilitated disease transmission rather than preventing it. The development of public health infrastructure in medieval cities was limited by technological and economic constraints. The lack of engineering knowledge and financial resources meant that cities could not build the sophisticated water supply and waste management systems that would be necessary for effective disease control. The gradual development of these systems represented important progress but was often too slow to prevent disease outbreaks. The development of hospitals in medieval cities was a significant advance, though these institutions were often more focused on providing spiritual care than medical treatment. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, St. Bartholomew's in London, and similar institutions provided care for the sick and poor, but they were often overcrowded and under-resourced. The hospital system that developed in medieval cities was primarily a religious institution rather than a medical one. These hospitals were often attached to monasteries or cathedrals and were staffed by religious personnel who had little medical training. The primary focus was on providing spiritual comfort to the dying rather than treating disease or preventing infection. The physical conditions in medieval hospitals were often as bad as those in the rest of the city. Patients were crowded together in large halls where diseases could spread rapidly. The lack of understanding of infection control meant that hospitals often became sources of disease transmission rather than centers of healing. The mortality rates in these institutions were extremely high. The funding of medieval hospitals was often inadequate and unreliable. These institutions depended on charitable donations and religious endowments, which could fluctuate dramatically depending on economic conditions and political circumstances. The lack of stable funding meant that hospitals often could not provide consistent care or maintain adequate facilities. The medical care provided in medieval hospitals was often primitive and ineffective. The staff had little medical training and relied on traditional remedies and religious practices rather than scientific treatments. The lack of understanding of disease processes meant that hospital care was often more harmful than helpful to patients. The economic inequality in medieval cities meant that disease affected different social classes in different ways. The wealthy could afford better housing, cleaner water, and medical care, while the poor were left to suffer in the worst conditions. This inequality created a cycle where disease would devastate the poor while leaving the wealthy relatively unscathed, at least until a major epidemic struck. The stark economic inequalities in medieval cities created dramatic differences in health outcomes between different social classes. The wealthy lived in stone houses with proper drainage and sanitation, while the poor were crowded into wooden hovels that were breeding grounds for disease. This inequality meant that the poor bore the brunt of disease outbreaks while the wealthy were relatively protected. The access to clean water and proper sanitation was largely determined by economic status. The wealthy could afford to build private wells and maintain proper waste disposal systems, while the poor relied on contaminated public water sources and had no proper sanitation facilities. This disparity in access to basic necessities created significant health inequalities. The quality of food available to different social classes varied dramatically. The wealthy had access to fresh meat, imported spices, and a variety of foods that were nutritious and safe, while the poor subsisted on adulterated grains and spoiled food. This difference in diet quality had significant impacts on health and disease susceptibility. The access to medical care was almost entirely determined by economic status. The wealthy could afford to consult trained physicians and purchase expensive remedies, while the poor relied on folk healers and traditional remedies. This disparity in access to medical care meant that treatable conditions were often fatal for the poor, while the wealthy could recover from similar illnesses. The legal systems in medieval cities were often ill-equipped to deal with public health issues. While there were laws against certain practices, enforcement was difficult and often corrupt. The lack of scientific understanding of disease meant that even well-intentioned laws were often ineffective or counterproductive. The legal framework for public health in medieval cities was poorly developed and often contradictory. Laws against dumping waste in the streets existed alongside practices that made such dumping necessary. The lack of alternative waste disposal methods meant that even law-abiding citizens had few options for proper sanitation. The enforcement of health laws was often arbitrary and corrupt. Officials who were responsible for maintaining public health were frequently bribed or intimidated into ignoring violations. The wealthy could afford to pay fines for violating health regulations, while the poor faced harsh punishments for similar offenses. The court system in medieval cities was often more concerned with generating revenue than protecting public health. Fines for sanitation violations were seen as a source of income rather than a deterrent to harmful behavior. This created perverse incentives where officials had little motivation to actually prevent health violations. The lack of professional law enforcement meant that health regulations were often enforced by part-time officials who had little training or authority. These individuals were often reluctant to confront wealthy or powerful violators and lacked the resources to conduct systematic inspections or investigations. The religious institutions in medieval cities had a complex relationship with public health. While they provided care for the sick and poor, they also promoted beliefs that sometimes hindered efforts to combat disease. The idea that disease was divine punishment for sin led to fatalistic attitudes that discouraged preventive measures. The role of religious institutions in medieval public health was contradictory. While monasteries and churches provided care for the sick and poor, they also promoted beliefs that sometimes hindered efforts to improve public health. The religious understanding of disease as divine punishment created barriers to systematic public health interventions. The hospital system that was developed by religious institutions provided important services but was often inadequate to meet the needs of urban populations. The focus on spiritual care rather than medical treatment meant that these institutions were often more concerned with providing comfort to the dying than with preventing disease or promoting health. The charitable activities of religious institutions provided some relief to the poor, but also created dependency relationships that could discourage self-improvement and community organization. The emphasis on accepting one's lot in life, rather than working to change it, could inhibit efforts to organize for better living conditions or public health measures. The religious festivals and ceremonies that were central to medieval urban life often brought large crowds together in ways that facilitated disease transmission. The communal sharing of food and drink during religious celebrations created opportunities for pathogens to spread, while the emotional intensity of religious experiences could weaken immune systems and make people more susceptible to illness. The merchant classes in medieval cities were particularly important in the spread of disease because of their travel and trade connections. Merchants often lived in better conditions than the general population, but their constant travel made them vectors for disease transmission between cities and regions. The merchant communities that developed in medieval cities often maintained social networks that spanned continents, creating pathways for disease transmission. The seasonal nature of medieval trade meant that disease outbreaks often coincided with periods of increased commercial activity. The arrival of merchant caravans or trading fleets would often be followed by outbreaks of disease, as pathogens that had been dormant during travel would find new hosts in the urban population. The economic importance of trade made city officials reluctant to impose health restrictions that might discourage commercial activity. The living conditions of merchant families were generally better than those of the general population, but they were still subject to the same environmental hazards that affected all urban residents. The merchant districts of medieval cities were often located near harbours or major roads, where they were exposed to pollution and contamination from ships and travellers. The warehouses and shops where merchants stored their goods were often poorly ventilated and prone to pest infestations. The international connections of merchant communities created opportunities for the introduction of exotic diseases to European cities. Merchants who travelled to distant lands could bring back pathogens that were unknown to local populations, potentially causing devastating epidemics. The lack of understanding of disease transmission meant that these exotic diseases could spread rapidly through urban populations before their origins were recognized. The craft guilds in medieval cities attempted to regulate working conditions and maintain standards, but they were often more concerned with protecting their economic interests than with public health. The guild system created monopolies that could keep prices high and quality low, contributing to the poor living conditions of the urban poor. The secrecy surrounding craft techniques meant that knowledge of occupational hazards was not widely shared. The apprenticeship system that was central to medieval craft production exposed young people to occupational hazards at an early age. Children as young as 7 or 8 might be apprenticed to craftsmen, exposing them to toxic substances and dangerous working conditions during crucial developmental years. The lack of protection for child workers meant that many suffered permanent health damage or died from occupational diseases. The guild system provided some protection for skilled workers through mutual aid societies and regulations, but these benefits were limited to guild members and often excluded the most vulnerable workers. The system created hierarchies within the workforce that could prevent cooperation on health and safety issues. The emphasis on maintaining trade secrets could prevent the sharing of knowledge about occupational hazards. The seasonal nature of much medieval work meant that workers faced different hazards at different times of the year. Construction workers might face exposure to cold and wet conditions during winter months, while agricultural workers dealt with dust and allergens during harvest season. The lack of proper protective equipment meant that workers were vulnerable to these seasonal hazards. The integration of work and living spaces in medieval cities meant that occupational hazards affected entire families. A blacksmith's family would be exposed to smoke and metallic particles from the forge, while a tanner's family would suffer from the toxic chemicals used in leather processing. The lack of separation between work and home life meant that occupational diseases could spread throughout households. The water supply systems in medieval cities were often inadequate and contaminated. While some cities had public fountains or wells, these were often insufficient for the population and were frequently contaminated by nearby sources of pollution. The wealthy might have access to private wells or cisterns, but the poor relied on whatever water they could find, regardless of its quality. The maintenance of water supply systems was often neglected due to lack of resources and expertise. Public wells and fountains would fall into disrepair, becoming sources of contamination rather than clean water. The lack of understanding of hydraulic engineering meant that water systems were often poorly designed and prone to failure. The seasonal variations in water availability created additional challenges for medieval cities. During dry periods, water sources might run low or become more concentrated with pollutants. During wet periods, flooding could contaminate water supplies with sewage and other pollutants. The lack of water storage facilities meant that cities could not effectively manage these seasonal variations. The competition for water resources often led to conflicts between different groups within medieval cities. The wealthy might monopolize the best water sources, leaving the poor to rely on contaminated alternatives. The lack of regulation meant that industrial users could pollute water sources without consequences, affecting the health of entire neighborhoods. The transportation of water within medieval cities was often done under unsanitary conditions. Water carriers would use contaminated vessels and might draw water from polluted sources. The lack of proper storage facilities meant that water would often become contaminated during transport and storage. The reuse of water containers without proper cleaning created additional opportunities for contamination. The fire hazards in medieval cities were enormous due to the wooden construction, open flames, and crowded conditions. Fires could spread rapidly through entire neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses, and leaving people homeless and vulnerable to disease. The lack of effective firefighting techniques meant that fires often burned unchecked until they ran out of fuel or were stopped by natural barriers. The construction materials used in medieval cities were highly flammable and prone to rapid fire spread. The use of wood, straw, and other organic materials meant that buildings would burn quickly and intensely. The lack of fire-resistant construction techniques meant that fires could easily jump from building to building, creating conflagrations that could destroy entire neighborhoods. The heating and lighting systems used in medieval cities created constant fire hazards. The use of open fires, candles, and oil lamps meant that sources of ignition were present throughout the city. The lack of proper chimney design and maintenance meant that fires could easily spread from hearths to building structures. The storage of flammable materials like straw and wood near heat sources created additional fire risks. The firefighting capabilities of medieval cities were extremely limited. The lack of organized fire departments meant that fire suppression depended on the voluntary efforts of citizens. The absence of effective firefighting equipment meant that fires could only be fought with buckets of water and simple tools. The narrow streets and crowded conditions made it difficult to access fires and evacuate threatened areas. The aftermath of fires in medieval cities often created additional health hazards. The destruction of buildings would leave debris and rubble that could harbor pests and create breeding grounds for disease. The displacement of residents would lead to overcrowding in undamaged areas, creating conditions that facilitated disease transmission. The loss of food supplies and cooking facilities could lead to malnutrition and food safety problems. The noise pollution in medieval cities was also a significant problem. The constant din of craftsmen, animals, and street vendors created a stressful environment that could affect both physical and mental health. The lack of building regulations meant that noisy industries operated right next to residential areas, creating additional stress for urban residents. The cacophony of medieval city life was overwhelming by modern standards. The sounds of hammering, sawing, and other craft activities would continue throughout the day, while the noise of animals, carts, and street vendors would add to the din. The lack of noise control meant that residents had no escape from the constant assault on their senses. The psychological effects of noise pollution were not understood in medieval times, but the stress of living in such a noisy environment would have weakened immune systems and made people more susceptible to disease. The lack of quiet spaces for rest and recovery meant that urban residents were constantly exposed to stress-inducing noise levels. The industrial activities that generated much of the noise in medieval cities also created other health hazards. The hammering of metalworkers would create vibrations that could damage buildings and create dust that was harmful to breathe. The noise from textile production would be accompanied by airborne fibers that could cause respiratory problems. The lack of regulation of noise-producing activities meant that there was no protection for residents from excessive noise. Industrial activities could continue throughout the day and night, disrupting sleep and creating chronic stress. The absence of zoning laws meant that the noisiest industries could be located in the heart of residential areas. The impact of warfare on medieval cities was devastating for public health. Sieges could cut off food supplies and clean water, while the presence of large armies could introduce new diseases and put additional strain on city resources. The wounded and sick from battles would often be brought into cities, overwhelming the limited medical facilities and creating opportunities for disease transmission. The siege warfare that was common in medieval times created particularly harsh conditions for city residents. The cutting off of supply lines would lead to starvation and the breakdown of sanitation systems. The crowding of people within city walls would facilitate disease transmission, while the stress of siege conditions would weaken immune systems and make people more susceptible to illness. The presence of military forces near cities created additional health hazards. Military camps were often breeding grounds for disease due to poor sanitation and overcrowding. The interaction between military personnel and civilian populations would create opportunities for disease transmission between different groups. The pillaging and destruction that often accompanied military campaigns would destroy infrastructure and create conditions that promoted disease outbreaks. The weapons and tactics used in medieval warfare often created wounds that were prone to infection. The lack of proper medical care for wounded soldiers meant that injuries that might be survivable today were often fatal. The contamination of wounds with dirt, debris, and infectious material meant that even minor injuries could become life-threatening. The psychological trauma of warfare had additional health consequences. The stress of living under constant threat of attack would weaken immune systems and make people more susceptible to disease. The destruction of social networks and support systems would leave people isolated and vulnerable. The breakdown of law and order during military conflicts would create conditions that facilitated the spread of disease and violence. The development of trade networks in medieval cities, while economically beneficial, also facilitated the spread of disease. The same routes that brought prosperity also brought pathogens, and the growth of international trade made cities vulnerable to diseases from distant parts of the world. The lack of understanding of disease transmission meant that trade goods could serve as vectors for pathogens. The expansion of trade networks during the medieval period created new opportunities for disease transmission on a global scale. The movement of goods and people along trade routes facilitated the spread of diseases between different regions and continents. The lack of quarantine procedures meant that infected goods and travelers could introduce new pathogens to previously unexposed populations. The storage and handling of trade goods in medieval cities was often done under unsanitary conditions. Goods would be stored in contaminated warehouses and handled by workers who might be carrying diseases. The lack of proper packaging and preservation techniques meant that goods could become contaminated during transport and storage. The seasonal nature of medieval trade meant that disease risks would vary throughout the year. The arrival of trading caravans during certain seasons would increase the risk of disease introduction, while the concentration of trade goods in warehouses could create breeding grounds for pests and pathogens. The lack of understanding of these seasonal patterns made it difficult to implement effective preventive measures. The economic importance of trade made city officials reluctant to impose health restrictions that might discourage commercial activity. The competition between cities for trade meant that health concerns were often secondary to economic interests. The lack of coordination between different cities meant that health measures implemented in one location might be undermined by lax enforcement in another. The social hierarchy in medieval cities created additional health disparities. The wealthy lived in better neighborhoods with cleaner air and water, while the poor were crowded into the worst areas of the city. The lack of social mobility meant that people were often trapped in these unhealthy conditions with no hope of escape, creating cycles of poverty and disease that could persist for generations. The residential patterns in medieval cities were clearly stratified by social class and economic status. The wealthy would live in the most desirable areas, typically on higher ground where drainage was better and air quality was superior. The poor were relegated to low-lying areas near industrial sites where flooding was common and pollution was concentrated. This segregation meant that the health impacts of urban life fell disproportionately on the most vulnerable populations. The access to public amenities was largely determined by social status. The wealthy might have access to private gardens, better water sources, and superior waste disposal systems, while the poor relied on overcrowded public facilities that were often poorly maintained. This disparity in access to basic amenities created significant health inequalities between different social groups. The legal protections available to different social classes varied dramatically. The wealthy could use their influence to avoid sanitation requirements and health regulations, while the poor faced harsh punishments for similar violations. The lack of legal recourse for the poor meant that they had no protection against the health hazards created by the wealthy and powerful. The occupational opportunities available to different social classes had significant health implications. The wealthy could afford to engage in less hazardous occupations, while the poor were forced to work in dangerous conditions with toxic materials. The lack of occupational safety regulations meant that workers in hazardous industries had no protection from health risks. The educational opportunities in medieval cities were limited, and even among the educated, knowledge of health and hygiene was poor. The prevailing medical theories were often wrong and sometimes harmful, leading to practices that made disease outbreaks worse rather than better. The lack of scientific education meant that even well-intentioned efforts to improve public health were often ineffective. The curriculum in medieval educational institutions was dominated by religious instruction and classical learning, with little attention paid to practical knowledge about health and hygiene. Students would learn Latin and theology but receive little instruction in basic health practices. The lack of empirical observation and experimentation meant that medical knowledge was based on ancient texts rather than direct experience. The medical training available in medieval universities was theoretical rather than practical. Students would learn the theories of ancient physicians but had little opportunity to study actual patients or conduct research. This approach to medical education meant that physicians were often poorly prepared to deal with real health problems in urban environments. The popular understanding of health and disease was based on superstition and folklore rather than scientific knowledge. People learned about health from traditional healers and religious authorities who often had little understanding of disease processes. The lack of scientific literacy meant that harmful practices were often passed down from generation to generation. The dissemination of medical knowledge was limited by low literacy rates and the lack of printing technology. Medical texts were rare and expensive, making them available only to a small elite. The oral transmission of medical knowledge meant that information was often distorted or lost over time. The lack of standardized medical education meant that the quality of medical care varied widely. The seasonal nature of work in medieval cities meant that employment and income were often unstable. The lack of steady income made it difficult for people to maintain decent living conditions or access medical care when needed. The seasonal influx of workers during certain times of the year also put additional strain on the already inadequate housing and sanitation systems. The agricultural basis of the medieval economy meant that urban employment was often tied to seasonal cycles. Construction work would be suspended during winter months, while harvest-related activities would create temporary employment opportunities. This seasonal variation in employment created cycles of poverty and prosperity that had significant health implications. The temporary nature of much medieval employment meant that workers often lived in unstable conditions. Seasonal workers might live in temporary shelters that were even worse than the regular housing stock. The lack of job security meant that workers could not invest in improving their living conditions or accessing medical care. The migration patterns associated with seasonal work created additional health challenges. The movement of workers between rural and urban areas could facilitate disease transmission between different populations. The overcrowding that occurred during peak employment periods could create conditions that promoted disease outbreaks. The lack of social safety nets meant that workers who became ill or injured often had no source of support. The absence of unemployment benefits or disability insurance meant that workers who could not work would quickly fall into destitution. The lack of medical care for workers meant that minor health problems could quickly become major disabilities. The role of animals in medieval cities was complex and problematic. While animals provided essential services like transportation and food production, they also contributed to the pollution and disease burden of cities. The lack of proper animal husbandry practices meant that diseases could easily spread between animals and humans, creating additional health hazards. The integration of animals into urban life was extensive in medieval cities. Horses and oxen were essential for transportation and heavy labor, while pigs and chickens were kept for food production. The presence of these animals in close proximity to humans created numerous opportunities for disease transmission and environmental contamination. The waste produced by urban animals was enormous and difficult to manage. The lack of proper waste disposal systems meant that animal manure would accumulate in streets and buildings, creating breeding grounds for flies and other disease vectors. The decomposition of animal waste would produce toxic gases that could cause respiratory problems and other health issues. The diseases that could be transmitted from animals to humans were numerous and serious. Anthrax, tuberculosis, and various parasitic infections could spread from livestock to humans through direct contact or contaminated food and water. The lack of understanding of zoonotic diseases meant that these risks were not recognized or addressed. The slaughter and processing of animals in medieval cities was often done under unsanitary conditions. Animals would be killed in public spaces with little regard for hygiene or public health. The blood and waste from slaughtering operations would contaminate water sources and create additional health hazards. The lack of proper meat inspection meant that diseased animals might be processed alongside healthy ones. The preservation of food in medieval cities was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was common, and people often had no choice but to consume contaminated or spoiled food. The techniques used to preserve food, such as salting and smoking, were often inadequate, and sometimes introduced additional contaminants. The methods used to preserve food in medieval cities were primitive and often unreliable. Salting was the most common technique. but the quality of salt was often poor and contained impurities that could cause health problems. Smoking was used for meat and fish, but the process could introduce toxic compounds that would accumulate in the body over time. The storage of preserved foods was problematic due to the lack of proper facilities. Foods would be stored in baskets, sacks, or wooden containers that offered little protection from rodents and insects. The lack of proper sealing meant that preserved foods would often become contaminated with droppings, hair, and other contaminants. The seasonal nature of food preservation meant that people would often go for months without access to fresh foods. The reliance on preserved foods could lead to nutritional deficiencies and health problems. The sudden availability of fresh foods after months of preserved fare could cause digestive problems and other health issues. The economic pressure to avoid waste meant that people would often consume food that was beginning to spoil. The lack of understanding of food safety meant that people might not recognize the signs of dangerous contamination. The masking of spoiled flavors with spices and other additives could hide the presence of harmful bacteria and toxins. The clothing and textiles in medieval cities were often sources of disease and contamination. The lack of proper washing facilities meant that clothes were rarely cleaned, and the materials used were often contaminated during production. The textile industries also created their own pollution and health hazards. The production of textiles in medieval cities involved numerous toxic processes. The preparation of fibers often involved the use of urine and other organic materials that could harbor pathogens. The dyeing process used chemicals that could cause skin burns and respiratory problems. The fulling process, which involved treading on cloth in solutions of clay and urine, was particularly hazardous. The wearing of contaminated clothing created numerous health problems. The lack of undergarments meant that outer clothing would quickly become contaminated with body fluids and waste. The materials used in clothing production were often irritating to the skin and could cause rashes and other dermatological problems. The storage and maintenance of clothing in medieval cities was problematic. The lack of proper storage facilities meant that clothing would often become infested with insects and contaminated with mold. The absence of effective cleaning methods meant that clothing would accumulate dirt, bacteria, and other contaminants over time. The social significance of clothing in medieval cities meant that people would often wear garments that were uncomfortable or unhealthy in order to maintain their social status. The use of expensive dyes and materials could create health hazards, while the emphasis on appearance over comfort could lead to clothing that promoted disease and discomfort. The legal rights of city residents were often limited, and this affected their ability to address health problems. The lack of democratic representation meant that the concerns of the poor were often ignored, and the wealthy could use their influence to avoid sanitation requirements while forcing the poor to bear the burden of unhealthy conditions. The feudal system that governed medieval cities created hierarchies that limited the rights of ordinary residents. The lack of democratic institutions meant that people had little voice in decisions that affected their health and well-being. The concentration of power in the hands of a small elite meant that public health concerns were often secondary to economic and political interests. The legal system in medieval cities was often biased in favor of the wealthy and powerful. The poor had little access to legal representation and were often unable to seek redress for health-related grievances. The lack of legal protections for tenants meant that landlords could maintain unhealthy housing conditions without consequences. The guild system, while providing some protection for skilled workers, also created barriers to entry that excluded many people from economic opportunities. The monopolistic practices of guilds could keep prices high and quality low, contributing to the poor living conditions of the urban poor. The lack of competition in many industries meant that there was little incentive to improve working conditions or product quality. The taxation systems in medieval cities often placed the heaviest burden on the poor, who were least able to pay. The lack of resources available for public health improvements meant that cities could not invest in the infrastructure needed to address health problems. The competition between cities for trade and commerce often led to the neglect of public health in favor of economic development. The impact of religious festivals and celebrations on public health in medieval cities was significant. While these events provided some relief from the grim conditions of daily life, they also brought large numbers of people together in close quarters, creating ideal conditions for the spread of disease. The communal sharing of food and drink during these celebrations created additional opportunities for pathogen transmission. The religious calendar in medieval cities was filled with festivals and celebrations that brought communities together. These events often involved large gatherings where people would share food, drink, and physical contact. The emotional intensity of religious celebrations could lower immune resistance and make people more susceptible to disease. The lack of understanding of disease transmission meant that these gatherings could become super-spreader events. The pilgrimage traditions that were central to medieval religious life created additional public health challenges. Pilgrims would travel long distances, often in poor health, and would congregate in large numbers at religious sites. The combination of travel fatigue, poor nutrition, and overcrowding made pilgrim gatherings particularly susceptible to disease outbreaks. The charitable feasts that were common during religious festivals could create food safety problems. The preparation and serving of large quantities of food under primitive conditions could lead to contamination and foodborne illness. The pressure to feed large numbers of people could lead to the use of spoiled or contaminated ingredients. The temporary structures and accommodations that were erected for religious festivals were often poorly constructed and overcrowded. The lack of proper sanitation facilities during these events could create conditions that promoted disease transmission. The temporary nature of these accommodations meant that there was little incentive to maintain proper hygiene standards. The development of early forms of insurance and mutual aid societies in medieval cities was partly a response to the constant threat of disease and death. These organizations provided some protection against the economic consequences of illness, but they were often inadequate and available only to certain groups. The lack of comprehensive social safety nets meant that most people had no protection against the financial devastation that could result from serious illness. The guild system provided some forms of mutual aid for skilled workers, but these benefits were limited to guild members and often excluded the most vulnerable populations. The mutual aid societies that developed in medieval cities were often based on religious or ethnic affiliations rather than universal coverage. The lack of standardized benefits meant that the quality of support varied widely between different organizations. The charitable activities of religious institutions provided some support for the sick and poor, but these services were often inadequate and unreliable. The dependence on voluntary donations meant that charitable services could be reduced or eliminated during times of economic hardship. The religious focus of these institutions meant that they often provided spiritual comfort rather than practical assistance. The family networks that were central to medieval society provided some support during times of illness, but these systems were often overwhelmed by the scale of health problems in urban environments. The high mortality rates in medieval cities meant that families were often broken up by death, leaving survivors without support systems. The poverty of most urban families meant that they had few resources to share during times of crisis. The lack of professional medical care for most of the population meant that people had to rely on traditional healers and folk remedies when they became ill. The quality of this care was highly variable, and dangerous practices were often passed down through generations. The persecution of traditional healers, particularly women, could reduce the availability of healthcare for the poor. The transportation of goods within medieval cities was often done by the same people and animals that handled waste, creating additional opportunities for contamination. The lack of proper logistics and supply chain management meant that food and other goods were often contaminated during transport and storage. The reuse of containers and vehicles for different purposes could spread contamination throughout the city. The carts and animals used for transportation in medieval cities were often contaminated with waste and other pollutants. The same cart that carried goods to market might also be used to collect waste or transport manure. The lack of proper cleaning and maintenance meant that these vehicles could spread contamination wherever they went. The loading and unloading of goods in medieval cities was often done under unsanitary conditions. Goods would be handled by multiple people and stored in contaminated facilities before being distributed to consumers. The lack of proper packaging meant that goods were often exposed to contamination during transport and storage. The routes used for transportation within medieval cities often passed through the most polluted areas. The narrow streets and poor drainage meant that transport routes were often muddy and contaminated with waste. The lack of proper road maintenance meant that transportation could be disrupted by weather and other factors. The workers who were involved in transportation were often among the most disease-prone members of society. The constant exposure to contaminated materials and environments made transport workers particularly susceptible to illness. The lack of proper protective equipment meant that these workers had no protection from the hazards they encountered. The impact of technological limitations on health in medieval cities cannot be overstated. The lack of effective building materials, tools, and techniques meant that cities were poorly constructed and difficult to maintain. The absence of scientific instruments meant that people had no way to measure or monitor the quality of air, water, or food. The primitive state of medical knowledge meant that even well-intentioned health measures were often ineffective. The construction technology available in medieval cities was primitive and often resulted in buildings that were unsafe and unhealthy. The lack of proper foundations and drainage systems meant that buildings were often damp and prone to structural problems. The use of organic materials in construction created environments that were attractive to pests and prone to decay. The engineering knowledge available in medieval cities was limited, which meant that infrastructure projects were often poorly designed and implemented. The lack of understanding of hydraulic principles meant that water supply and drainage systems were often inadequate. The absence of proper surveying techniques meant that construction projects were often poorly planned and executed. The medical technology available in medieval cities was extremely primitive. The lack of effective diagnostic tools meant that diseases were often misidentified or not recognized at all. The absence of effective treatments meant that even minor health problems could become serious or fatal. The lack of surgical techniques meant that many conditions that are easily treatable today were incurable in medieval times. The communication technology available in medieval cities was limited, which made it difficult to coordinate responses to health crises. The lack of rapid communication meant that disease outbreaks could spread unchecked while authorities were unaware of the problem. The absence of record-keeping systems meant that it was difficult to track disease patterns or learn from previous outbreaks. As we near the end of our journey through these pestilent medieval cities, it's important to remember that the people who lived in these conditions were not somehow different from us. They were human beings with the same basic needs and desires for health, safety, and prosperity. They did their best to survive and thrive in circumstances that we can barely imagine, facing daily challenges that would overwhelm most modern people. The resilience and adaptability of medieval urban populations was remarkable. Despite the terrible conditions they faced, people continued to build families, create art, and maintain communities. The development of trade networks, craft guilds, and mutual aid societies represented attempts to create order and support systems in chaotic and dangerous environments. The innovations that emerged from medieval cities, while often inadequate by modern standards, represented important steps toward better public health. The development of hospitals, the establishment of trade regulations, and the creation of waste management systems all contributed to gradual improvements in urban conditions. The lessons learned from these early efforts would eventually lead to more effective public health interventions. The cultural and intellectual achievements of medieval cities are all the more remarkable when we consider the conditions under which they were created. The great cathedrals, universities, and works of art that emerged from these disease-ridden environments represent triumphs of human creativity and determination over adversity. The gradual improvement in urban conditions that began in the later medieval period was the result of hard-won experience and countless small innovations. The development of better building techniques, the establishment of public health regulations, and the growth of medical knowledge all contributed to slowly making cities more livable. The accumulation of knowledge about disease and sanitation would eventually lead to the public health revolutions of later centuries. The lessons learned from these medieval urban nightmares would eventually lead to the public health reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries. The understanding that disease was not just a personal misfortune but a public problem that required collective action was a crucial development in human history. The recognition that environmental conditions could be changed to improve health outcomes was a revolutionary insight that emerged from the harsh experiences of medieval urban life. The development of scientific medicine and public health as disciplines was directly influenced by the experiences of medieval cities. The observation that certain environmental conditions were associated with disease outbreaks led to the development of epidemiological thinking. The recognition that collective action was necessary to address health problems laid the foundation for modern public health practice. The legal and political frameworks that emerged from medieval cities also contributed to the development of modern public health. The establishment of municipal governments with responsibility for public welfare created institutions that could address health problems on a community-wide basis. The development of legal systems that could regulate individual behavior in the interest of public health was an important precedent for modern public health law. Today, as we face new challenges from urbanization, climate change, and emerging diseases, we can look back at these medieval cities as a reminder of how far we've come and how much we have to lose if we don't protect and improve our urban environments. The modern city, with its clean water, sewage systems, and public health infrastructure, is one of humanity's greatest achievements, built on the hard-learned lessons of our ancestors. The public health infrastructure that we take for granted today, clean water systems, sewage treatment, food safety regulations, building codes, and medical care was developed in response to the terrible conditions that characterized medieval cities. The investment in public health that modern societies make is a direct result of the understanding that these investments prevent the kind of suffering that was common in medieval times. The global nature of modern public health challenges means that we must continue to learn from the experiences of medieval cities. The rapid spread of diseases in interconnected urban environments is a problem that medieval cities faced on a smaller scale. The challenges of providing adequate housing, sanitation, and medical care for growing urban populations are not fundamentally different from those faced by medieval cities. The importance of addressing health inequalities is another lesson that we can learn from medieval cities. The stark differences in health outcomes between rich and poor in medieval times are a reminder of the importance of ensuring that public health improvements benefit all members of society, not just the wealthy and powerful. The medieval city was indeed a disease-ridden hellhole, but it was also the crucible in which many of our modern institutions and practices were forged. The hospitals, universities, and governance systems that emerged from these terrible conditions laid the foundation for the better world we live in today. The suffering of medieval urban populations was not in vain if we can learn from their experiences and continue to build more healthy and equitable cities. The story of medieval cities is ultimately a story of human resilience and the gradual progress of civilization. The people who lived and died in those fetid streets were not just historical curiosities, but our ancestors who endured unimaginable hardships to build the foundation of our modern world. Their struggles with disease, poverty, and environmental degradation are ongoing challenges that we must continue to address. The technological solutions that we have developed to address urban health problems are built on centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. The water treatment plants, sewage systems, and medical facilities that protect our health today are the result of lessons learned from the failures and successes of medieval cities. The continued investment in public health infrastructure is essential to maintaining the progress that has been made. The social and political institutions that support public health in modern cities are also products of the medieval experience. The recognition that government has a responsibility to protect public health emerged from the understanding that individual actions alone were insufficient to address the health challenges of urban life. The development of professional public health services was a response to the inadequacy of traditional approaches to health and disease. The importance of education and scientific knowledge in addressing public health challenges is another lesson from medieval cities. The gradual development of medical knowledge and the establishment of educational institutions were crucial steps in improving urban health conditions. The continued investment in research and education is essential to addressing the health challenges of the future. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your clean, safe, modern home, take a moment to appreciate the invisible infrastructure that keeps you healthy and the centuries of human struggle and innovation that made it possible. The medieval city dwellers who lived and died in those fetid streets were not just historical curiosities, but our ancestors who endured unimaginable hardships to build the foundation of our modern world. The water that flows from your tap, the sewage system that carries away your waste, the food safety regulations that protect your meals, and the medical care that keeps you healthy are all products of the lessons learned from medieval cities. The public health infrastructure that we take for granted is the result of centuries of gradual improvement and innovation. The comfort and safety that you enjoy tonight are not inevitable but the result of human effort and ingenuity. The fight against disease and urban squalor is ongoing, and each generation must do its part to maintain and improve the conditions that make healthy urban life possible. The medieval experience reminds us that progress is not automatic but requires constant vigilance and effort. And so, as we close this chapter on one of history's most challenging periods, let us remember that progress is not inevitable but the result of human effort and ingenuity. The fight against disease and urban squalor is ongoing, and each generation must do its part to maintain and improve the conditions that make healthy urban life possible. The lessons of medieval cities are not just historical curiosities but practical reminders of the importance of investing in public health and maintaining the infrastructure that protects our well-being. The medieval city may have been a disease-ridden hellhole, but it was also the birthplace of many of the institutions and practices that make modern urban life possible. The hospitals, universities, and governance systems that emerged from these challenging conditions continue to serve us today. The gradual progress from medieval squalor to modern public health is a testament to human resilience and the power of collective action. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your rest be undisturbed by the ghosts of medieval cities past. May you wake tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for the public health infrastructure that protects you and a commitment to supporting the continued improvement of urban conditions for all people. The story of medieval cities is ultimately a story of hope that even the most challenging conditions can be overcome through human effort and determination. Until next time, when we'll explore another fascinating corner of history together, sleep well in the knowledge that you are the beneficiary of centuries of human struggle and progress. The medieval city dwellers who suffered in those disease-ridden streets would marvel at the world we have built, and it is our responsibility to continue building on their foundation, creating cities that are not just economically prosperous but healthy, equitable, and sustainable for all who live in them. The night is peaceful now, far from the chaos and disease of medieval streets. Rest well, and dream of the progress yet to come.